Hello dolls, and welcome back to another video. Last year during my Vlogmas series, where I broke down every single year from 1960 to 1979 in fashion, music, film, and art, I made an episode on the year 1973. And in that video, I spoke about the night when American fashion conquered the French runaway. It all happened in one night, a fashion standoff, the Battle of Versailles. And today I would like to take a closer look together with you at this incredible night and what it was like and what really happened there, because this really was the night where the primary focus that had been on Paris as the #1 fashion capital of the world for decades started to slowly but surely shift over to America. It was the first time that American designers really showed that they did more than just design sports clothes. And it was the first time that Europeans started to realize that American designers might be onto something. So today I would like to take you back to a special night in a French castle. Welcome to the Battle of Versailles. Heels clicked on the marble floors and chandeliers trembled with laughter and clinking champagne glasses. On a cold night in November of 1973, the gilded halls of the Palace of Versailles filled with 700 of the world's most glamorous people. Princesses and socialites in mink and satin, movie stars and artists, billionaires and baronesses. They had gathered for what was billed as a charitable gala to restore Louis XIV one splendid palace. But everyone in that opulent opera house knew they were really there for a showdown, a fashion face-off for the ages. In one corner, the undisputed kings and queens of haute couture, the French who had dictated fashion in the world for decades. In the other, a scrappy team of American designers, eager to prove that their style could stand equal to Paris's finest. They called it the Battle of Versailles, and though no blood would be shed, reputations and egos were certainly on the line. It was a clash of old and new, aristocratic tradition versus modern energy, all playing out under frescoed ceilings and 18th century gold trim. Princess Grace of Monaco swept in wearing Dior with a crimson cape de Grès. Andy Warhol mingled with European royals. Josephine Baker, the legendary black entertainer who once danced for 1920s Paris, prepared to perform one more time at age 67. Backstage, Liza Minnelli, fresh of an Oscar win, huddled with a nervous pack of American models, whispering encouragement. The air was thick with anticipation, perfume, and a whiff of rivalry. The French establishment didn't saw the Americans as competition. They saw them as glorified sportswear peddlers who had somehow been invited to France's grandest stage. The Americans knew the French viewed them as underdogs, and they were determined to deliver a show that would leave the old guard's powdered wigs spinning. They had no idea just how dramatic, chaotic, and ultimately triumphant the night would be. By the time it was over, the style hierarchy of a century would be upended in a mere 37 minutes of magic. This isn't just a story about a fashion show. It's about culture and change, pride and prejudice, and the moment American fashion came of age under the most unlikely spotlight. This is the story of the legendary 1973 Battle of Versailles fashion show, when American fashion conquered the French runway. Chapter 1, Setting the Stage, a palace in decline and a bold idea. The seeds for the Battle of Versailles were planted by an American publicist with an eye for spectacle. Her name was Eleanor Lambert. By 1973, Eleanor was already a legend in fashion circles, the architect of New York's Fashion Week, the Met Gala, and the Best Dressed list. When the curator of Versailles, Gérard van der Kemp, came desperately seeking funds to restore the crumbling palace, Eleanor Lambert saw an opportunity. Why not host a grand gala, a luxurious dinner and a fashion show in the very palace that needed saving? And to ensure maximum buzz and wealthy attendees, why not pit France's top designers against America's best on the same stage? It was an audacious idea. At that time, French haute couture was unchallenged as the pinnacle of fashion. Parisian designers like Yves Saint Laurent and Hubert de Givenchy set the trends. Everyone else just followed. In fact, American clothing manufacturers routinely licensed and copied French designs, openly and legally. French couture was an art. American fashion fashion was often dismissed as mass-marketed sportswear, so the notion that 5 American designers would share the spotlight with 5 French masters in a formal show at Versailles seemed almost comical to the European elite. As one observer recalled, quote, "Everyone thought this was a joke, yet Eleanor persisted, and the event was set for November 28th of 1973. The lineup was fashion versions of an all-star game, representing France, the grand names of couture, Yves Saint Laurent, Christian Dior, led by designer Marc Bohan, Hubert de Givenchy, Pierre Cardin, and Emanuel Ungaro, representing the upstart United States, Oscar de la Renta, Bill Blass, and Klein, accompanied by her 25-year-old assistant, a then unknown Donna Karan, Halston, and Stephen Burrows. While Anne was the only woman presenting, Stephen Burrows, at just 29, was the youngest designer and the only black one. He was the first black designer to win the prestigious Coty Award and was eager to present his designs at Versailles. Each designer would present about 8 outfits, and whichever side put on the more dazzling spectacle would earn the bragging rights. Officially, it wasn't a competition, but everyone knew it absolutely was. The venue itself added high drama. The Théâtre Gabriel at Versailles was a jewel-box theater built in the 18th century, all blue velvet, marble, and gold, originally inaugurated with a performance for Marie Antoinette. By 1973, the palace was literally falling apart. Leaky roof, termites in the woodwork, insufficient heating, which gave the whole affair a feeling of faded glory. The world was in the throes of energy crisis, and some journalists sniffed at the extravagance of a $235 a ticket charity gala during those tough times. Van der Kamp retort, quote, "Beautiful things must go on, Versailles must be heated," an almost let-them-eat-cake defense of art over austerity. Nevertheless, the prospect of the party of the year at France's most storied place drew high society in droves. On the night of the show, limousines streamed into the courtyard, unloading fur-wrapped millionaires, heiresses, and international jet-setters. As one report described it, the coats checked at the door, sumptuous sables, minks, ermines, quote, "could have carpeted the ballroom wall to wall, and the guests themselves glittered like flower bouquets and feathered chiffons, and mermaid sequin gowns." The scene was set for a feast of fashion. Chapter 2. David versus Goliath, French Couture and the American Underdogs. To understand the tension in the air that night, one must grasp the sheer cultural gap between the two camps. The French designers were the monarchy of fashion, heirs to a tradition of couture houses, dressing royalty, and café society since the days of Chanel and Dior's new look. They were used to present lavish collections in gilded salons or grand ateliers with aristocratic clients in attendance. Their models were almost aristocratic themselves. Elegant, reserved beauties who glided through shows in near silence, like living statues. As Robin Giffen, a fashion critic and historian of the event, noted, haute couture shows were often hushed, almost reverential affairs. Quote, "At a house like Balenciaga, those shows took place in silence. Clothes were serious art, not entertainment." By contrast, the American designers came from the rough and tumble world of 7th Avenue ready-to-wear. They made chic clothes for modern life, simpler, sportier, meant to be worn on the street or at the office, not just couture salons. And they treated fashion as theater and pop culture. In early 1970s America, music, dance, and youth culture were crashing into fashion. Models were encouraged to smile, groove to the music, even dance down the runway, an unheard-of idea in stuffy Paris circles. The Americans also embraced diversity in a way Paris had not. They arrived in France with 36 models, including 10 black models, an unprecedented number at the time. Many of these models, Pat Cleveland, Bethann Hardison, Alva Chin, Billy Blair, and others, were statuesque, charismatic women of color who brought personality and a new kind of energy to the stage. The gap between French and American models was obvious. They were all stunning, of course, but while the French models were meant to be mannequins, putting all focus on the clothes, the American models presented not only the clothes, but themselves as well, laying the groundwork for a new style of modeling. In 1973, just a few years after the US civil rights movement, this was quite literally revolutionary. As one writer later put it, Versailles would make the fashion world, quote, understand the power of American sportswear and the African-American heroines who modeled it as a force against the airtight traditions of French haute couture. In the lead-up to the event, however, the Americans felt like the poor cousins invited to the king's ball. They had far fewer resources and faced logistical snags at every turn. For starters, the budget disparity was laughable. The French spent extravagantly on elaborate stage sets and props. The Americans scraped by with roughly a $50,000 production budget. Just to put that into perspective, that was so low that they couldn't even afford to ship heavy sets from the US. And then something happened that happens to the best of us. The American set designers made a grievous error by measuring in inches instead of centimeters. So the backdrops they did bring ended up being the wrong size for the Versailles stage. On rehearsal day, things went from bad to worse. The French team, with an attitude of entitlement, hogged the stage far beyond their allotted rehearsal time, leaving the Americans literally waiting in the wings. The theater was drafty and cold, technical equipment failed, and the frustration soon mounted. So I actually got the chance to visit the Castle of Versailles a couple of years ago, and it was truly one of the most impressive places I've ever been to. And that comes from someone who grew up in Central Europe in a place where there are hundreds of castles around us. Like every other town here has a nice castle, and a lot of them are built after Versailles. However, Versailles is kind of like the big thing. It's the big deal, and it's stunning, but you have to understand that the history of Versailles, it once was this giant building, and it housed thousands of people at times, and not everyone living there was wealthy, and the area that they were now putting the show in used to be like a theater, and so it used to be very beautiful. However, by the time that this happened in the 70s, it obviously had been out of use for an enormous amount of time. World War II had happened, there were things destroyed, and it was just, there was no money to replace a building like that. You have to understand, the amount of money you need to repair a building like Versailles is unimaginable. And so it is truly beautiful. You can go there now, it's a museum, but the idea behind this was actually quite brilliant. But the American designers that were waiting for their turn to go on stage and like test everything, they were probably freezing because it was very cold, very windy. You have to keep in mind, it was November and the building wasn't prepared for what they were planning to do there. Inside the American camp, egos clashed. Superstar designer Halston, known for his sleek minimal designs and even sleeker personal style, threw a legendary tantrum during rehearsal. Accounts differ on the exact cause. Some say he was furious that the French delay cut into his rehearsals. Others say that he quarreled with the show's American choreographer Kay Thompson, a former MGM musical director. Whatever the trigger, Halston dramatically stormed out and Thompson quit on the spot in solidarity. For a brief moment, it looked like Team USA might self-destruct before the battle even began. And then there was Liza Minnelli, Halston's close friend and America's showstar performer. With Halston fuming and designers bickering, Liza rallied the troops. She reportedly gathered the American models and designers and delivered a simple but passionate pep talk. Look, this is bigger than us. The show must go on. Chastened and refocused, Halston returned. One can imagine him flipping his silk scarf over his shoulder in defiance, and the Americans scraped together a last-minute plan. They would make virtue of their minimalism. If they didn't have fancy sets, they doubled down on energy, music, and charisma. As the audience took their seats, program booklets in hand, a few suspected the backstage drama that had unfolded. Most assumed the real drama would happen on stage. Could the brash Americans actually measure up with the couture's royalty? Even the American designers had their doubts. Quote, "We thought we were just there to be background noise for the French," one later admitted. But all of that was about to change in spectacular fashion. Literally. Chapter 3. The French Spectacle, Tradition in all its glory and excess. The home team, the French, took the stage first and they pulled out all the stops. This was, after all, their turf and their pride. To lend the evening a proper sense of grandeur, they enlisted stage legend Jean-Louis Barrault, a famous French actor and director, to direct their portion of the show. What followed was a 90-minute extravaganza that felt like a cross between an haute couture parade and a Broadway variety show, albeit one from a bygone era. It had numerous set pieces, musical interludes, and even literal props the size of parade floats. Each French designer presented his collection in the form of a theatrical vignette, complete with its own themed set piece. For example, Pierre Cardin, ever the futurist, had a giant cardboard rocket ship, while Christian Dior's segment featured a massive pumpkin coach straight out of Cinderella. The models glided out in exquisite couture gowns, impeccably tailored and outrageously expensive, but the clothes often took the backseat to the pageantry around them. The French had an entire live orchestra playing and, at some point, even had not only one but two live rhinoceroses parade the stage. An ostentatious nod to the exotic, maybe? Legendary entertainers graced the French show. The glamorous Josephine Baker, draped in a sequin bodysuit and towering feather headdress, opened the French set to a great fanfare. Halfway through, ballet superstar Rudolf Nureyev performed a dance, eliciting gasps of delight. Iconic French singer Dalida and British actress and singer Jane Birkin made appearances, as did French chanteuse Zizi Jeanmaire, who crooned "I'm Just a Gigolo" for Saint Laurent's segment. Even French film heartthrob Louis XIV popped up alongside Jane Birkin for Emanuel Ungaro's portion. It was a cavalcade of stars and scenes, star-studded, but the production lacked cohesion, one critic observed later. Another journalist noted that the French presentation suffered from last-minute shifts and poor editing, feeling disjointed and slightly passé despite its charm. Indeed, the French seemed to be pandering to nostalgia. The whole spectacle was rooted in the glories of the past. One reviewer quipped that the French half was, quote, about as contemporary as a bustle, gorgeous, yes, but old-fashioned and cumbersome in its overdone opulence. If the goal was to celebrate Versailles itself, the French hit the mark. Their show felt like a literal throwback to a royal court entertainment that Marie Antoinette herself might have recognized. There was plenty of splendor. The audience beheld sumptuous 18th century style sets, Baroque music, and those magnificent couture creations shimmering under the stage lights. But there was also a sense of fatigue. 90 minutes is an eternity to sit through even the most beautiful fashion display, and some in the crowd began shifting in their velvet seats as the French segment stretched on and on. Grand, oui, but also a bit grandiose. As the French wrapped up their final float and the orchestra hit its last triumphant note, there was polite applause. The French designers took their bows, confident they had shown the Americans what real elegance looked like. Yet in the audience, a certain restlessness was palpable. Grace Kelly and her society friends had just sat through an overly rich meal of French pomp, and they were about to get a palate cleanser they couldn't see coming. Later, a journalist who admitted that the mood at the Opera House after the French show was rather blasé, the locals had expected to be wowed, but instead witnessed something lovely that nonetheless felt like yesterday's news. Little did they know the next course was about to serve up 1973 in all its glory, right there in the old palace. Chapter 4. The American Coup, Broadway Sparkle and Dancing Models. Then a burst of fireworks. 1973 burst into Versailles. The American segment began, and from the very first moment it was clear that this was an entirely different approach. The lights dimmed, a hush fell, and out strutted Liza Minnelli in a Halston pantsuit, belting out "Bonjour Paris." It was a cheeky choice, an American singing a show tune greeting the city of light, and it brought delighted laughter and cheers. Backing her was a crew of dancers and models who moved in sync, turning the stage into a mini Broadway revue. The Americans had dispensed with elaborate sets, Instead, they used dramatic lighting, music, and pure performance to create atmosphere. Liza served as the common thread throughout the Americans' 30-minute-long presentation. She opened the show, introduced each designer's segment with a musical cue, and returned for a grand finale. Fresh of her Academy Award for Cabaret, Liza infused the night with a jolt of a film's jazz energy. One could almost imagine Joel Grey's MC winking in the wings. Each American designer then showcased their collection, their way, but all flowed as a cohesive review. There were contemporary pop tunes, numbers set to the soulful grooves of Barry White and Al Green, even snippets from edgy rock soundtracks of films like Scorpio Rising. The soundtrack alone was nothing like Versailles had ever heard before, thumping bass lines and Motown melodies echoing off Rococo walls. And then there were the models. They didn't just walk, they danced, they strutted, they owned the stage. Legendary model Pat Cleveland twirled with such exuberance that her soft jersey dress flared out like a joyful halo. Beth Ann Hardison strode out with bold, fierce pride, making eye contact with the audience, something unheard of in Paris shows. Alva Chin, Billy Blair, Norma Jean Darden, Charlene Dash, and many more black models were center stage, radiating personality. The Americans had intentionally cast a diverse group, and their presence was electrifying. It brought a liveliness to everything instead of just being a couture house that was very silent. Ladies having tea and looking at girls walking around them, Pat Cleveland later said of that moment. Indeed, these models moved to the music, swaying hips to the rhythm, throwing playful poses, and even engaging the audience with winks and smiles. It was infectious. The staid French audience, who had never seen a fashion show turn into a dance party, began to loosen up. Feet tapped, laughter rose. Each American designer's mini collection seemed to celebrate modern life. Oscar de la Renta showed sexy, slinky dresses with a touch of Latin flair. Bill Blass brought his all-American tailored glamour. And Klein presented chic mix-and-match sportswear that a working woman could actually wear, her segment quietly nodding to women's growing independence and choices in fashion. Halston, ever the showman, dazzled with minimalistic yet sensuous gowns, and he'd cannily sprinkled a few recognizable celebrities among his models. One was model actress Jane Holzer, a Warhol superstar, though the French didn't know her. Stephen Burrows, the youngest and most daring of the bunch, sent out vibrant outfits in jersey and chiffon that popped with color and fluidity, unlike anything the French had ever seen. Burrows' designs had an almost street fashion edge and even incorporated Afro-Caribbean influences and sparkly disco touches. His models, many of them black, frolicked down the runway to funky beats. Later, people would say Burrows stole the show for the Americans, but in truth, each of the 5 designers contributed a crucial piece of seamless American tapestry. It was youthful, it was sexy, it was fun, and it still oozed sophistication, just in a fresh way. The audience could hardly contain their excitement. Partway through the American set, a ripple of cheers turned into something you never see at a fashion show. Spontaneous, raucous applause in the middle of a runway presentation. As the final segment concluded, Liza Minnelli returning in a top hat and tuxedo, leading all 36 models in a big kick-line finale to Cole Porter's Everything Goes, perhaps the crowd erupted. They didn't just clap, they stood up and threw their programs into the air like confetti. Not once, but twice, waves of ecstatic applause and program tossing swept the hall. Princess Grace herself reportedly hurrahed in delight. In those 30 minutes, the Americans had done the unthinkable. They outshone the French in their own palace. When the house lights came up, the French designers and their society friends were shell-shocked. But many were also impressed to the point of cheering for their rivals. Legend has it that Yves Saint Laurent, the crown prince of Paris fashion, approached Stephen Burrows and congratulated him on his remarkable work. The stiff hierarchy between French couture masters and young American upstart seemed to melt in that moment of genuine respect. As the fashion author Deborah Draper later said, quote, "The American segment pulsed with the vibrancy of the groovy disco era. and a more liberated view of femininity, and it was impossible to deny its appeal. The Battle of Versailles had a clear winner that night, Team USA. Chapter 5. They came, they sued, they conquered. The aftermath. The morning after the big show, the fashion press could talk of little else. Women's Wear Daily, the industry's top magazine, ran a triumphant headline, quote, "Americans came, they sued, they conquered." It was as if the revolution had been acknowledged by Versailles' own court chroniclers. Virtually every account declared the Americans the unanimous winners of that night. And yet, interestingly, nobody felt the French had lost in a ruinous way. After all, the whole event did raise money for Versailles, about $260,000, a tidy sum, even if it was far short of the $60 million needed for the renovations. But it for sure was a beginning. Many in Paris took in stride that the new era had dawned. The French designers, initially so dismissive, gained a new respect for American talent and innovation. Quote, "The French and the American segments were as different as the Chateau of Versailles and the Seagram building," one reporter noted. Both impressive in their own way, but one rooted in the past and one pointing to the future. In the weeks and months after Versailles, the immediate impact was tangible. American designers saw their prestige and sales skyrocket in Europe. French buyers who once sneered at US clothes started ordering American collections for their high-end boutiques. Oscar de la Renta, Bill Blass, Halston, and others suddenly found themselves celebrated as couturiers in their own right, not merely copyists. Quote, "Following the event, American designers' sales started to boom abroad," reported the Washington Post. The psychological boost for American fashion was even greater. No longer did New York designers feel like provincial cousins to Paris. They now knew they could hold their own. As Bill Blass later admitted, much of the stress before Versailles was the feeling they had to, quote, "prove themselves worthy of Paris." After winning that night, future generations of US designers were freed from that inferiority complex. Designer Donna Karan, who had witnessed the Battle of Versailles as Anne Klein's young assistant, would go on to build a global brand without ever feeling second class to France. Decades later, Robin Giffen observed that one reason an American like Alexander Wang could confidently take the helm at a venerable French house, in his case Balenciaga, it was because Versailles, quote, "lifted a weight from the American fashion industry and forced the French to acknowledge the value of American design." Another profound legacy of that night was its impact on diversity in fashion. The sight of 10 stunning black models owning the runway at Versailles reverberated far beyond the evening. In 1973, racial inclusion in high fashion shows were still limited, especially in Paris. But after Versailles, as Pat Cleveland put it, quote, "they couldn't get enough of those girls." Suddenly, the very models who had struggled for equal opportunities were in high demand. Beth Ann Hardison, for one, became an international star and later a vocal advocate for diversity in modeling. In 2011, decades later, the Versailles models, those 10 black women who changed the game, were collectively honored with their contribution to fashion history. The Battle of Versailles showed, in living color, that beauty was not monolithic and that runaways could and should reflect the real world. As one writer noted, it stands as a reminder of, quote, "how exciting and necessary change can be. In an industry often slow to embrace it, this night broke off the future." I have made a full video all about the wonderful black supermodels of the 60s and 70s and what it was like for them. I'm just going to link that here in case anyone wants to see it, to give you an idea of what it was like in the 60s and then how this night really changed so much for these women. And what I love about it is that it wasn't the night that changed it for them. It was these girls. It was this group of women and a bunch of other black models who worked so hard in the 60s and 70s to get recognized, and they were the ones who broke the barrier. And that is so truly impressive and wonderful that I really wanted to make a separate, in-depth video for them. In the end, the Battle of Versailles became a kind of mythic victory party for American fashion. It's often compared to a sports championship or a cultural revolution. David slaying Goliath in Halston and hot pants, one might joke. But it wasn't a route in a mean-spirited way. In fact, many French insiders privately admitted that the Americans had given the whole fashion world a much-needed jolt. Quote, "It did more for diversity than people want to say," reflected filmmaker Susan Hootstein decades later. To have 10 African-American women representing the industry, quote, "among all those snooty snobs right after the civil rights movement was a bold statement," she noted. It paved the way, however gradually, for more inclusion on fashion's global stage. Chapter 6. Legacy of a Legendary Night. As the years went by, the legend of the 1973 Versailles showdown only grew. It wasn't just a one-night sensation. It truly altered the trajectory of fashion. Historian Robin Given, who later wrote a whole book about it, said, quote, "So much of what happened at Versailles was a reflection of the time, a convergence of social change, racial progress, and shifting attitudes about women and style. The Americans had emphasized ready-to-wear and freedom, showing clothes that moved with the body and lives of modern women, rather than confining them. This philosophy took hold industry-wide. By the late 1970s and 80s, American designers were leading trends, and Paris had adapted by incorporating more ready-to-wear sensibilities and even hiring American talents to helm French houses. The playing field had leveled. The story has been told and retold, gaining a little bit of sparkle every time. In 2012, an excellent document titled Versailles 1973, American Runway Revolution, featuring interviews with many who were there, models, designers, and journalists, recounting those extraordinary moments. In 2016, another film, Battle at Versailles, narrated by Stanley Tucci, brought archival footage to the light. Fashion magazines still reference the event as a touchstone of runway history, especially when discussing diversity or the rise of American luxury brands. In 2021, the Netflix drama series Halston reenacted the Battle of Versailles in a lavish episode, introducing a new generation to the tale of a fateful night. And as recently as 2023, 50 years on, a board game was released that lets players symbolically replay the duel between Team France and Team USA. Few fashion shows claim that level of pop culture immortality. Looking back, what's truly compelling about the Battle of Versailles is how it was far more than just a fashion show. Yes, it had the fabulous trappings, famous designers, gorgeous models, celebrities galore, and a fairy tale location. But beneath the sequence, it spoke to something deeper, a shift in power and perspective. It was about American designers stepping out of Europe's shadow and declaring that their ideas of beauty and style were just as valid and visionary. It was about Black models breaking barriers by simply being themselves, bold and beautiful, on a stage that had excluded them for far too long. It was about the old world meeting the new world, and the new world taking a well-deserved bow. In the glittering salon of Versailles, fashion's past and future danced together that night in 1973. The result was nothing less than a revolution in couture. And perhaps the most poetic part? In triumphing at Versailles, the Americans helped save the very palace that symbolized old-world opulence. They won the battle and contributed to restoring a piece of world heritage. Talk about a win-win outcome. Today, if you stroll through the restored halls of Versailles or watch a modern fashion show full of diverse models and pulsing music, you're witnessing the legacy of that legendary evening. The Battle of Versailles has long since passed into fashion lore, an almost mythic tale of underdogs and elegance, of rhinestones and rhinoceroses, of tradition humbled by innovation. In the end, it proved that fashion is not static. It's a living art, one that can capture the spirit of its time and even help change society's fabric. On that November night, in a dilapidated French palace packed with wealth and power, a group of American designers and Black models did the unthinkable. They changed the course of fashion history with nothing more than great clothes, great music, and the courage to be different. They came, they sued, they conquered, and the world of style would never be the same. So that is it for today's video. That is it for the Battle of Versailles. Ever since I made that video in December of last year, I have gotten questions about going more into detail about the Battle of Versailles, and I was so excited to finally take some time to truly research this, because there is a lot out there. It's just hard to access. It is hard to find the documentaries. Like, there's a lot there, but you need to know what you're looking for in order to find it. And I think it is so interesting how this fashion show changed so much of modern fashion and laid the groundwork for so much of the fashion shows that we see nowadays. Yet I feel like this show is also kind of forgotten about by now. And I really think that we should work on making sure that these stories do not get forgotten, because it is so important to look at this to understand how the fashion markets shifted. I've made a video comparing American fashion to European fashion in the 60s and 70s, and how each place had their different approaches to making fashion. And I feel like that is truly interesting when you look at this night that was the showdown of so much. And I think it is wonderful how, yes, the Americans won, but it wasn't like the French never sold another piece of clothing after that. It's just, there was more. It's almost like the fashion world gained another place, another group of designers, and just so much more to look at and work with, and that is truly beautiful. But yeah, I would absolutely love to know what you think about the Battle of Versailles, and which of these designers you would be most excited to have seen present that night. I have to say, I'm a big fan of Pierre Cardin. I own pieces, and that would probably be my number one. However, I feel like you should have been there for the Americans, so I'm probably gonna go with Stephen Burrows, because his fashion is truly beautiful as well, and he's such a revolutionary designer. But yeah, I would love to know what you're thinking. If there are any more specific places, dates, people you would like me to talk about, you can always put them in the comments and I'll take a look. If you enjoyed the video, I would love you to give it a thumbs up and maybe even share it with a friend. It supports me, it supports the channel, and it would truly mean the world. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine, take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls!
I hope the worst has already come.